Hey, this is Nick from JangaFX, and today I'm going to be showing you how to navigate EmberGen's user interface. To fully understand the software, you need to understand everything that you're seeing, and I think that in this video we're going to answer most introductory questions that you might have about EmberGen's interface. And so we're going to show you how to navigate the software, how to open presets, how to change things in the node graph, create new nodes, add things to your timeline, and a whole slew of other things. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first screen that you're going to end up on whenever you launch EmberGen is the home screen. And over on the top left, you have your login so that you can log into your JangaFX account. If you don't have one, you can go ahead and click here. You can click sign up, create an account with the email that you purchased your license with, and then click sign up, and then you will be able to log in inside of EmberGen. We are currently on the main home screen. And the first thing that it shows is recent projects. It may not show anything if you haven't ever launched EmberGen before. And you will notice that some of the thumbnails are the same. That's because thumbnails are inherited from the project that you start creating variations from. And inside of your project settings, you can generate new thumbnails if you want. You can also start from 3 different default presets. So we have, say, a default explosion. We can go back to the home, a default fire, and a default smoke. It's very easy to come in and edit any of these parameters, and these are a great base for you to start with, or to start making cool simulations with these 3 different types of sims that EmberGen is really good at. We also have a What's New tab, which is basically a feed of our most recent videos here on YouTube, and so you will soon see this tutorial popping up right here in the What's New section. You can go and click any of these and learn new things and watch some of our latest content. Then over on the left, we also have a Learn section, and this is where you'll find some of our other tutorials. You can also find some of our past live streams. Then we have guided tours. So for instance, if you wanted to learn how to export images, we have a little walkthrough tutorial that kind of tells you all these things, and we can go ahead and skip that. But if you want to follow walkthrough tutorials, we have a couple of those too. And then if we go to presets, these are all the presets that come with EmberGen 1.0, and you can click any of them and open them. So say if we want to open the dry ice one, we can navigate around it inside the viewport, and you can see that everything loads instantly because nothing inside of EmberGen caches. Projects are also tagged, so if you want to see different fires or fire and smoke, if you want to see just fire, you want to see just smoke, you want to see explosions, magic, particles, presets that work on 8 GB cards, presets that work great on 24 GB cards for your VRAM. It's all cool. And we have certain keywords, say maybe game or tech or smoke or whatever, and you can search presets as well. Then you also have my projects, and these are things that I've been working on my machine, and then it just kind of realizes it. So I've got, say, like, Diablo Inferno or whatever. And it's cool that you can just kind of go in and see your most recent projects. And then lastly, you can join our Discord. You can also go to our forum. You can create a new project, which has a different default, which is just normalized values for all of our different nodes. And then you can open a project, and then there's our social media stuff. So next, we're going to start with the file menu, and you can open projects, create new projects, find your most recent projects, save, and then save as to rename it as a different file, or my favorite, which is increment and save. So say you have a new variation and you want to save this right here, but not destroy, say, plain engine fire 7, you can go here, increment and save. And then if we go back and open number 7, you can see that it's not changed, but if we open number 8, it is the changed version. So this is a great way to iterate on your files, and the shortcut for that is Alt-Shift-S. So we're going to go back to my main project there. You've also got your edit options, various simulation things. I would just recommend learning these key bindings for resetting the sim, pausing the sim, stepping through the sim with Z. So R resets, space pauses, and Z steps 1 frame at a time when the sim is paused. You've also got your settings, so you can choose to edit project settings like the thumbnail. You can edit some of the general settings. You can change the quality of your renderer, add a note for your projects, and you can show that on open. So say if somebody on your team needs to know something, you can go ahead and make a note of like maybe the project that it's for or whatever it happens to be. And that's pretty cool. And then in the preferences, you've got general preferences. And one thing that I'll note is that if you are using something like a Wacom tablet or just a tablet in general, you want to enable mouse compatibility mode. We also have a number of different layout options. So say we have like our legacy layout for EmberGen, a flipped layout for EmberGen, and then our default. And then if you are on a lower end graphics card or you just want to limit the amount of frames and lower your GPU usage, you could say something like 30 frames per second as a frame renderer, or 60 or whatever it happens to be. 0 is unlimited and is the default. And then if you're trying to use MIDI inputs, you have to enable MIDI support through this checkbox and then choose your MIDI port. We also have viewport quality. These can be toggled through Control 1, 2, and 3 to do low, medium, and high. And you also have a list of all your shortcuts. And then here is your camera mappings. So default is actually more akin to Unreal Engine 4, and I'll kind of go through those controls here in a bit. You also can choose Blender controls or industry compatible, which I believe is Maya style controls. So we're going to change that back to default. You also have sensitivity options and inverting the direction and things like that. And then finally, user variables. It's a bit complicated, so not going to go into that. So the next thing is the viewport itself. And within the viewport, you can see your bounding box for the simulation. You can see particular gizmos for any entity type. And so we can click any entity over here on the right-hand side inside of the node graph window. And we can move those things around inside of the viewport with various gizmos and so on. We can press Control Z to remove that action and send it back. And you can see that everything inside of EmberGen is real-time and interactive. You can also see things like the ground, the skybox, and so on and so forth. If you have particles, you would see them here. And this is basically more or less what your final render is going to look like as well. We have a number of different render options. And one thing I want to do is press Shift S to bring up my stats panel. We also have this view option up here, which is going to give you most of the controls that you need for your viewport. And so we could say render at high quality, which is also bound to Control 3. But typically I work on Control 1, which is the fastest. You can see here that Control 1 is about 7.2 milliseconds, whereas Control 3 is about 15.5, maybe 14 milliseconds, depending on where my camera is positioned and so on and so forth. And those numbers will change based on your GPU and the simulation size and things like that. So we're going to go back to Control 1 and lower the render quality. The cool thing is that you can't tell much of a difference because our renderer is so optimized, but it is quite interesting to be able to mess around with those things. And typically Control 3 is used automatically in the export, but we don't have to worry about that stuff right this second. You can see all of the different hotkeys on some of the main things here inside of the viewport. So for instance, you can press B to show and hide your bounding box. We can press Shift S to get rid of this menu. But one good thing that it's for is for the VRAM. So if you have, say, 8 gigabytes, you want to know how many gigabytes of VRAM you're using. In my case, my card has 24, and that's why it shows 23.6 here. So pretty interesting, and it's a good thing to keep in mind. So B shows and hides the bounding box. M will show and hide your simulation. H will show and hide the actual shapes here. And then let's see if I missed anything. I don't necessarily think I did. One thing that I will note is that whenever I'm working inside of EmberGen, I typically turn off entity icons. And these are preferences that will save pretty much forever on your machine for any build for EmberGen. So if you change any of this stuff, it's just going to save your preferences. And by default, I do not work with entity icons because I feel that they get in the way for the most part. So this is pretty much the viewport. And a little bit of navigation tips is if you look down on the bottom of the screen, and I mean all the way at the bottom, you can see it says like left click for camera rotate, middle click for camera pan, right click for first person, etc. Anytime you're in a different mode, whether you have the Blender mode set up or the industry standard or whatever, that bottom panel is going to tell you some of the most important keys, depending on what tab or section of the viewport or user interface that you are hovering over. And so if we want to navigate, we can left click to rotate around our simulation. We can right click to enter a free mode where you can use WASD and then the scroll wheel to kind of fly around at faster speeds. And in this case, I'm moving pretty slowly because the simulation scale is actually quite huge. But if it were a smaller sim, we would fly around the viewport a lot faster, or at least seemingly a lot faster. So that's pretty interesting. You can also middle mouse to pan around, and if you want to reset the the pivot point of where your camera is pivoting around, you can press G, and that's going to reset your pivot point. And then, for instance, let's say that we wanted to pivot around maybe one of our shapes. We can click that shape here in the node graph, and then press T, and that's going to focus us on that particular object, and then we can rotate and orbit around that particular object, which is quite helpful. Now, one of the next things is you'll notice that we have a couple of tabs up here. And so by default, whenever you go to the render tab, it's going to select the camera farthest down the list. And so, but we can go back to render 1. Render 2 for me is the second camera that I use to capture a thumbnail. Now, one of the big things about this tab, and we can just go ahead and pause the simulation so that we're not using up so many resources. And if we click here, this is going to show us the viewport render output. And this is what would actually output if we went over here and said, hey, I want to do maybe render all or smoke or whatever it happens to be. And so now you can see that we have a checkbox here because this is actually what's going on in the render node. You can also add different capture types, so say emissive and scattering or whatever, and you can preview your node hookups here. But we'll go over all this stuff in a different export tutorial. But in general, what you see here is what you're going to get doing your export. So you can see scattering, you can see, alpha channels and depth and motion vectors and whatever. And any parameters that are editable for any of these output types will be down here. So you can change, say, the blur radius of this, or with 6-point lighting, you can, boost the smoke density, or, have a black background instead of a white background, and different things to affect the output directly out of EmberGen. And it's really cool that these are all of the different things that you can export from EmberGen, and you can preview all of those before you set up your exporter. So, and then inside of the export tab, we have a simulation here that I've already exported out, and you can scrub it. You can also play, you can pause and kind of skip through frames. You can go all the way to the end, you can go to the beginning. You can set the frame rate that you want to preview it at. And the cool thing is that this is reading directly off the disk. And since we don't have caching, this is a quick way to kind of go back through, say, a play blast or whatever it's called, kind of a flip book of your animation. And this can support hundreds and hundreds of frames. You can also view, say, the red channel, green channel, blue channel, the alpha channel if you have one. You can also choose, say, a different channel if you've exported multiple ones. And that's pretty much it for this particular screen. Now, one last thing I'll mention about the viewport is for any panel inside of the user interface, you can press Control Space to maximize it, and then can press Control Space again to get out of that. So that's a pretty cool thing to go over. Now, one of the last things I'll mention about the general UI and the viewport is if you go between any panel, you'll see kind of 2 arrows pop up as your cursor, and you can move and rescale things as needed. And by default, I probably work in an area, something like this, with these different ratios. This is generally my typical setup. And depending on my sim, I just kind of go through and manage my tabs. And you can also undock tabs and move them around if you want to. So say, for instance, we could put the node graph anywhere else we want. We could, change the node graph to be up here and then kind of reset all this stuff. So pretty interesting. So, but just for the ease, let me go back to, say, my preferences. We'll go to general, and we will set up default to reset it. And that's the quickest way to fix things if you've kind of messed up your panels or whatever it happens to be. I will also mention that you cannot undock a panel yet and then put it on another window. That's a feature that we have planned for the future, but for now, unfortunately, it's not possible yet. So the next thing is the node graph. And within the node graph, it's quite simple to navigate. Over here on the left, you have your shapes that are part of your emitters. That plugs into your different emitters, and then those plug into the simulation node. Coming back out from the simulation node, you have various forces, you have colliders and things like that. You can plug in multiple emitters into the emitter pin. You also have it going into, say, your volume post-process node, which allows you to change things like, the smoke dilation, or you want to sharpen your smoke, add motion blur, things like that. Then you have the general scene, which is going to allow you to change, various colors and tone mapping things, HDR, etc. And then finally, you have like your render node. We also have some other nodes like lights, color gradients, your ground, your skybox, various shading parameters for, say, things like flames or whatever it happens to be. And so pretty interesting stuff there. So the node graph in general is pretty simple. And I'm going to have a tutorial where I go over in detail what all of these different nodes do and kind of the flow of how EmberGen works and the order of which things are. But in general, this is a fairly simple node graph, and the vast majority of simulations are going to have pretty much all of this stuff and maybe a couple of emitters or whatever. But for the most part, all of this stuff is pretty standard inside of any simulation. Now, to navigate around the node graph, you can middle click to pan, you can use the scroll wheel to zoom in, and you can right click to see all of the different node types that you can pop up. Now, one interesting thing is if you want to spawn new nodes, you can use the right click menu. You could search, say, something like, gradient or whatever, or you could search shape and find all those different modifiers if you want. But the easiest way is to just drag off of any pin and then let go. So say we'll drag off, let go. It'll show us what we can attach to that pin. In this case, it's an export VDB. You can also go backwards and we can say, hey, I want to spawn a collider, and then I want to add in a shape primitive, or I want to spawn in a new emitter, and then I want to spawn in a shape primitive, or maybe I want to import a mesh object or whatever it happens to be. And so you can do all of that really quickly instead of trying to navigate this right-click menu. And so that's kind of a speedy way to work. If you have a number of items that you want to put into a comment, you can press highlight those nodes by left-clicking, dragging a box, and then pressing C for a comment. And you can go here and rename the comment, so we can say, my comment or whatever it happens to be. And then you can also rename nodes. So say, for instance, we have this emitter volume that we created. We can just say, hey, my new volume or whatever it happens to be. And it's like an easy way to kind of get around and do things, especially if you use the search bar up here. You can say volume, and it will help you find some of that node. Or if you know the exact name, you can say my new, and then it's going to open the node details for you automatically by selecting that node only. You can also edit multiple nodes as long as they're the same type by selecting both of them. And now you can see it says editing 2 nodes. You can do the same thing with different primitives. So we have these 2 shape primitive nodes. I can click this one and then control click the other and then edit both of those. Wherever it says multi, you can go in and set all to a specific number, and then from there you'll be able to edit that particular thing, which is quite cool. I'm going to go ahead and reset my project by reopening it so that we can clean the node graph back up. And then say that there's an instance where some of your nodes are kind of all tangled up, or maybe they're not in a good spot and you just want to clean things up. You can press Alt-A, and that will put them all together and make them really tidy. You can also do the same thing by selecting nodes and then right-clicking and do Auto Arrange, and that's going to arrange your nodes in a way that is really nice. Now we're going to go over the Node Details panel. And so within the Node Details panel, we have the ability to click any shape or object or node or whatever within the node graph. And then as we click these, you can see that the node details change based on the node that we're selecting. In general, you have a number of tabs depending on the node that you are clicking on. I think the most advanced one is probably either the simulation node or shading, and then you can kind of go through and click any of the tabs. It's also an infinite scroll type system. So if you know where the parameter is, you could just kind of click around and scroll, or say, hey, I want to go to smoke, and then it'll take you there directly, which is pretty cool. So for instance, if I go to my shape primitive, there's a drop down type menu. And so I'm going to show you how to interact with that. So you can just click here and then choose any shape that you want. And that's going to choose the appropriate shape that you've selected. And these parameters might change based on that. Of course, if you want to interact with a checkbox, you can click the checkbox on and off, and that's pretty easy. And then next, you might encounter these types of sliders where you can see we have, say, our position. And to change that, you can either go into the viewport and change it just like this and move it around. You can see this number right here changing. You can also do the same thing with stuff like rotation. And in this case, we have to hit, say, W or click one of these little widgets over here. And that's going to rotate around our object, and you can see these things are changing. If we want to reset a parameter, we can reset it like so. And unfortunately, that's now going to mess up where our position was. But that's pretty cool because now it's on the floor and it's making a burning column of fire or whatever. But regardless, you can also type in custom numbers by single clicking instead of clicking and dragging the slider back and forth. So we could say, say 10 and 15 and then 5 or whatever. And that's going to give us direct numbers to where our radius is, or sorry, our position. Now, if we wanted to, say, make our radius bigger than 50, because you'll notice that a lot of our parameter types have a pretty hard cap at, say, 50 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever it happens to be, based on what we've deemed to be the best ranges for a particular parameter. But you can type in any other number you want. So we could say 500 if we want to. And then you can kind of go back down and then, slide back and forth between the new bounds that you've set for that parameter. Now, you can also right click and then set a custom bound. So you could say, hey, I want my max to be 100, and then you can go all the way to 100 on that parameter, or you can just type in the number that you want instead of clicking set bounds. Now, if you want to reset the bounds for a particular parameter, there's this new option here that popped up as 3 little ellipses or whatever. You can click that, do reset bounds, and then that's going to disappear, and it's going to go back to 0 to 50 for any of your parameters. Now, another thing that you might encounter inside of the node details is, say, in the injection tab of a particle emitter, you'll see curves like this depending on what type of thing you're injecting, whether it's velocity or fuel or flames or whatever. So you can see if we start to activate this fuel, it's going to pop up with a curve. And then from here, we can click various curve presets, or we can control click any of the points that we want. You can also box select. It's kind of hard to box select if they are all the way in the corners, but we can just do this. And we can right click and we can say, hey, we want these to be smooth. We want them to be auto clamped. We want them to be linear, or whatever it happens to be. We want them to be a constant, type for the particles or whatever. And this is basically, over life of the particle, these different curves. And so you're going to encounter curve graphs like this from time to time, which is pretty interesting. And then you can also flip the curve horizontally. And so, for instance, if we, change back to one of our curve defaults, you can kind of flip it back and forth, and it's pretty cool to just change these things over life. So that's how you interact with those. And then finally, one of the other unique things that we have is, say, a min-max slider. And so how it works is, so for instance, this right here is on our flames parameter in the shading node. You see that we have these little grabby handles, and then we also have a histogram paired with it to show you what the temperature range is inside of your current simulation. And so basically, if you want to change the maximum value, you can change that slider with this handle. And then we have a minimum slider here to change the min. If you want to type in something custom, you can click either the right or left side of the box, and that's going to allow you to edit the min or the max. So we could say 500 and 1,000 or whatever. That's going to change it. Now, if you want to change the min max on kind of a sliding scale, you can click in the middle on this highlighted gray part. So we can make it bigger so you can see it. You can click here one time and then drag back and forth. That's going to let you change your range evenly with, say, 1,000 in between or whatever, and you want to slide that back and forth. So that's how min-max sliders work, and you'll see them in quite a few places inside of EmberGen. Now, I'm going to go ahead and reset my project by reopening it. And one of the next things to mention is, say, exposing things to the timeline or even to the node graph. So we have these little circles here, and if you hover over it, it will give you a tooltip on what each thing does. And so, for instance, if we click once, that is going to assign it to the timeline over here. And then if we click it twice, it's going to expose it to the node graph, where we can do things like plug in oscillators for the position, and oscillators are quite detailed, and so I'll go over those in a different tutorial most likely, but more or less they generate a signal and then they have a particular output, and you can plug those into any shape that you want or any input that you want, and it will generate generative motion for you instead of having to keyframe things on the timeline. And so, but regardless, we can also delete nodes with delete if we want to, and so on. So clicking again will undo all of those changes and then kind of go back to the default that it had, or maybe whatever the last value was of, say, the oscillator. And of course, we can reset it here. You can also hover over any particular thing if you don't know what it is. So say if we go to something more complicated, like maybe vorticity or something, it'll tell you all the different things for those in the tooltips. And you can also go to help and then documentation if you want to learn more about different parameters and such. Then the next thing would probably be the favorites tab. And so beside any particular parameter, you have a star. And so if there's a parameter that you work with a lot, you can click these little stars, and those are going to show up inside of your favorites tab. And that's quite cool. And then you can go to the particular shape or node or whatever it is by clicking the top bar that is kind of denoting where these parameters start or whatever. So this is the node that they go to, and you can click them to go to that node automatically in the graph for the node details. And then we also have timeline. And this is just the parameters that are going to show up on your timeline if you happen to want to see what parameters are exposed to it. And then lastly, we have a randomized section. And to add things here to the randomized section, you can go to node details and then shift click this little circle. And that's going to add in a dice icon. And the cool thing about the randomized section is by default, any seeded type parameter for noise or any kind of generative thing that the software does, you can click randomize all, and it's going to randomize all those different parameters and generate different noise patterns for us, generate different particle spawns, so on and so forth. Or say if we went here and changed, say, our radius, so shift click to be, our rotation to be a randomized seed. Now whenever we randomize, you can see that the shape or the rotation of this shape is actually changing whenever we click the dice up here in the node graph, or we click the randomize all button. So this is a great way to generate randomized explosions or fire or whatever it happens to be with the different seeds that you create. And so for the last piece of this, which is our timeline, I've went ahead and gone back to our home screen, and I'm going to choose maybe this artillery explosion because I know it has a few things here on the timeline that are already edited. We're just going to zoom out here and go to our node details, and maybe we'll click our emitter volume, which is here. So you can see here we have emitter activity keyframe to the timeline, we have this, and we have pressure rate and so on. And of course, if we go to the timeline tab, now we can actually see some keys that are already here on the timeline, which is cool. So we'll go back to node details, and maybe we can expand our timeline a little. So if you want to collapse any objects and not see the keyframes, you can click these little arrows to do so. You can also select a bunch of keys and move them back and forth if you want to kind of retime things, but keep everything with the same spacing. You can also do some pretty cool things. So say if we have this shape and we wanted to keyframe by hand its position, we could expose this to the timeline by clicking once. We can make sure that Auto-Keyframe is enabled by having this little red diamond filled in with like a little square. And so now we can go ahead and pause the sim. Let's reset it, and then we'll move this once, and then that's going to set up some keyframes, and we can zero those out if we want to. And then if we move our timeline scrubber to the next place that we want, it's going to generate a key. And so we can just move it again. It's going to generate a key wherever I leave that. move it again, it's going to generate a key. And so now if we play the simulation back, you can see that it's going to match that keyframe for us. And so you can also see a curve view, but actually before I do that, you can add new keys by yourself as well for, say, something like maybe volume post-processing or maybe the smoke rate or whatever, by shift clicking anywhere. And you can see that it has a ghost of where that key is going to spawn. You can click any particular key and the timeline playback bar is going to go back to that position. And if you want to edit things, you can either right click and set the value. You can set the frame that it's at, set, interpolation modes and so on, like we did for the other curves. Or you can just change the value here, which is quite interesting. Another thing that you can do, and another way to visualize this, which is more powerful, is to click this curve editor. I personally highly suggest you add your keyframes first and then go into your curve editor. And you can see it's pretty crazy by default. So if we just want to edit some of the emitter stuff, we can go here to volume post-process, turn that off, turn off our noise stuff, turn off our shapes, and we can even turn off individuals so that we only focus on the curve that we want. And then just like the other curves that we talked about that were inline in the node details, you can do things like smooth it. You can do, free-flowing handle types. You can reset the handles. You can say go here and then, manually edit your curves. You can press shift click to add in new keys once again, or you can make everything linear if you don't want things to ease in and so on and so forth. You can move keys around. You can see the new value that it's going to generate. And then you can see like the percentages and so on and so forth. So, and then this is your frame range from left to right. If you want to rescale the timeline, you can control and then use your middle mouse scroll wheel. And then if you want to pan, you can use middle mouse to pan as well. And so that's pretty interesting. And then say if you want to go to a certain number of keys, you can fit the view to all keys by using these various things, which is pretty neat. So pretty cool way to reset your timeline if you kind of get messed up. And so I think that's pretty much it whenever it comes to EmberGen and the timeline. And one of the last things I will actually mention for the timeline, because it's in my notes here, is if you want to loop the timeline, you can go down here and then click, say, maybe repeat. And then that will repeat in this section right here. And so this little circle thing or playback button is just going to go here. And like if we add it down to here, it's going to reset the whole simulation and everything. Or we can do a loop, which would actually loop our simulation, but we can't do that right this second because we have emitter particles. But in one of our examples for game, you can go here, game fire loop, and this actually has a real true loop set up automatically for you, which is pretty cool. So that's pretty much it. I think I've covered everything. And so I hope that this tutorial helped. I hope that you learned a lot about how to navigate EmberGen and learned where a lot of the things are and kind of what things do. And I hope to put out some more tutorials here soon to go over everything. So thanks for watching. Thanks for trying EmberGen, and thanks for learning it. And catch you next time.